the best way to help people understand symbolism is not to tell them what they are, but to ask them what they see.
Yeah.
Right.
Their own
So
interpretation of whatever it is that they're.
Right. And the interpretation isn't the answer. There is no answer. Dreams have more material in them than we'll ever know. But if you're going to get something out of your dream work, you, the dreamer, have to be curious about what your associations are. And associations aren't thoughts.
Welcome to Playing with Perspective, the suspended animation podcast, where we hear real stories from real people and we tackle all sorts of fun topics in the areas of business, marketing, entrepreneurship, mindset, the arts, and, well, life itself. It's amazing what you'll pick up. Thanks for joining us. Well, welcome everyone. It's another fantastic episode of Playing with Perspective, the suspended animation podcast. We're climbing the numbers. It's episode 247. And I've got the fantastic Nicholas Samstag with me all the way from New York. How you doing, Nicholas?
I'm all right, thanks.
Nice to have you on the show.
Oh, it's great to be here, Darren. Thanks so much for inviting me.
My pleasure. We're going to be chatting all about mental dialogue and why we are having the conversations we are having. So we're going to dive deep into psychoanalyzing ourselves and others with Nicholas. I'll give everybody a little bit of a snapshot as to what Nicholas does. So Dr. Nicholas Samstag is a clinical psychologist and psychoanalyst, seeing patients in the financial district of New York City and wider via Zoom. He sees a great portion of his job as helping his patients uncover and develop a psychological narrative of where they come from and where they are today. Dr. Samstag has an extensive background in classics and literature that greatly informs his work. He offers clinical supervision to psychoanalytic candidates and psychiatric residents as well. So welcome to the show, Nicholas.
Well, thanks.
Or shall I call you Dr. Samstag?
I think you should just call me Nick. That's what I
think. Nick is good. All right. Awesome. I mean, this is a fascinating field, and obviously there's been lots of study and it evolves constantly over the years as well. But I'd love to get an idea as to how you got into this work in the first place. What drew you to psychoanalytics and psychology in the first place?
Sure. So I had a pretty circuitous journey myself in terms of my education. It took me a long time to figure out what it was that I wanted to do. I started off in school studying theater and dramatic arts. And among the different readings I read this guy named Stanislavski, who was a Russian dramaturg and had read a lot of Freud, this guy, for actor. So I was acting at the time, and Stanislavski came up with some very psychological tools to help actors get into their roles. And the psychology that he used was Freudian psychology. He read a lot of Freud. So I came to Freud through Stanislavski.
Right. Through acting.
Through acting, right. Well, the idea, in method acting is that you build a psychological profile for the character you're playing.
Yeah.
You don't just go on stage and try to, strike certain poses. You actually have a whole history.
Yeah.
So I found that very interesting. And then at a certain point, I realized I was not going to be an actor. I was much more interested in literature. I think I was an okay actor, but I went to Columbia and I got a second BA in English literature. And then while I was there, I mean, this always sounds crazy when I tell this story. When I was there, I got a fellowship to study ancient Greek and Latin.
Oh my God.
And so I did that, and I got a master's in ancient Greek and classics. And then I realized I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I thought I was interested in intellectual history, and I was, but I was in the classics department, which is not typically interested in that sort of thing. So I started writing advertising for Time magazine and the 7 magazines they had there. This is a long-winded story. I'll try to keep this short. And while I was doing that, I was dating a girl who was in therapy.
Right.
And she was one of those few people who didn't proselytize, but seemed to be getting a lot better. She was pretty nutty, but as I went on with her, she got less nutty.
Right.
And I thought, well, that's really interesting, because I had developed this tendency to be antagonistic with my superiors. I wasn't a very good team player. I thought, you know what? There's some stuff I should probably look at. So I got into therapy. And that's really what did it. I just found it so eye-opening, the notion of the unconscious and how we stumble around in life, not really knowing what the hell we're doing in so many ways.
Yeah.
So that started it. Things happened. My mother died. I went back to school. I had no psychology coursework. So I got a master's and then applied to a bunch of schools and got into SAM and got the PhD in clinical psych. And then while I was doing that in typical form, I realized, well, I'm not really interested in being a psychologist, although I value that. What I really want to do is be a psychoanalyst. So then I found a place and studied for another 4 years and got a psychoanalytic certificate. So it's taken me.
And just out of interest for the people and for myself, for people out there, what's the difference between psychology and psychoanalytics?
Clinical psychology means that if you're a clinical just means you're dealing with people. Mm-hmm. So you're not running rats and you're not doing research necessarily. Clinical means you're seeing human beings in some form of therapy.
Gotcha.
Psychoanalysis is typically a postdoctoral training where you study Freud and you study a lot of his followers, and there's a lot of contention and differences of opinion, arguments and all. But basically, the idea is that as a psychoanalyst, you understand that human perception is necessarily the confluence of both conscious and unconscious process.
Right.
So on the one hand, it's what's out there, the actual world. And we often disagree on what the actual world is, but for example, we are doing a podcast and you and I are human beings and that stuff. So that's the so-called real world. But what's also informing us are all kinds of things coming from our unconscious. And it's not the unitary unconscious of early Freudian theory, but we've known that there is we call it an unconscious as if it's one thing. It's not actually one thing, but there are all kinds of experiments on many different levels that have shown that we really don't know how much we know. Right. And so psychoanalysts hear your story, whatever your story may be, both from the standpoint of the actual world, so-called, and then are also curious into what the symbolisms are and what the secondary and tertiary meanings are of the story you're telling.
And do psychologists not get involved as much into the subconscious? I thought they would.
There are a lot of psychologists who have nothing to do with the unconscious.
Really?
There are a lot of psychologists. No, there are psychologists who are interested in treating people with cognitive behavioral techniques, which typically are like you teach people things. That's what you basically do there.
Yeah, but you don't delve into the why or the driving factors that are underneath or the triggers or whatever else.
No, and there are certainly a lot of flavors out there. I mean, there are a lot of different flavors of psychological therapy and certainly psychoanalysis. But by and large, the psychoanalysts are into it more than the other folks.
Interesting. And just to clarify, it's the unconscious versus the subconscious, isn't it? You mentioned.
I think it's just simpler to say.
Very similar.
Unconscious, conscious. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Love it. Yeah. And so I've heard you talk about being psychologically minded and how that might affect your day-to-day interactions and your general state of being. What does that mean, psychologically minded?
Right. That's a great question. So in any given exchange, if you were to observe in any given exchange that you're witnessing, there's the literal things that are happening. So you and I are having a conversation about all this, and that's what's actually happening, right? Yeah. On an unconscious level, all kinds of things are happening also that we wouldn't actually know about unless we were curious about them, right? Mm. There's the tone of our voice, there's the way we're sitting, there's all kinds of things that are happening. That's true in any given human exchange. So from an academic standpoint, we often talk about process versus content. The content would be the actual words that are said, but the process would be everything else. The way language is used, the choice of language, the tone of voice, all of that can be indicators of interesting psychological things. So to be psychologically minded is to be aware of that.
Gotcha.
Like just because you shouted at somebody doesn't mean you're angry, right? How do you know that? It depends on how you're shouting at them.
Yeah, and that's the key, I suppose, is to always be aware of your own psychological state as well as the other person or the other people that you're exchanging with at the
Yeah,
same
I don't
time
think,
as the content.
yeah, I think that would be the goal. I don't think we ever are or could be or probably
Mm.
should be completely are. But I think
Yep.
curiosity is a major tool. If you're curious about psychology, if you're curious about anything, actually, I think you're better off. And I think, certainly true since the explosion of digital media and everything else that I find people are often not that curious. I just had a session before I came on with you.
Mm.
Very smart patient I've been seeing for years, who's in a relationship where his partner doesn't really evince any curiosity about him.
Right.
Doesn't ask him any questions.
Well,
Doesn't really, right? So, like, what's going on there?
yeah.
I mean, we can't assume anything, but there are. I mean, one of the many things I find fascinating about my job is exactly this kind of thing. Like, there's certain people who very quickly will become agitated and irritated
Yeah.
if no one is interested in them, and
Yeah.
other people it would never occur to,
Yeah.
right? They would say, like,
Yeah.
why aren't you asking me any questions about anything? And on the other hand, there are people, if you ask questions to, they run for the hills. They don't
Yeah.
want to. They don't.
What are you diving at? What are you probing me for? Just let me be. It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So
I
curiosity.
would say being curious about another person is like a very common symbol of being interested in them. I mean, if you're not going to ask questions about somebody, you're not that interested in them. But it's obviously much more complicated than that.
Yeah, I mean, found that out very quickly in the beginning of my clinical work that I would say most patients do respond very positively when I'm interested in them and I ask them questions. But boy, there are some who just run for the hills.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about asking any kind of provocative questions. I'm just,
Yeah.
it's like, what was it like for you growing up? It's like,
Yeah. Whoa. It's like, go there. Wow. It's fascinating because
yeah,
it's also from both sides. The person asking the question also might have their own preconceived ideas and narrative around should I probe or should I not probe for whatever reason. So it works both ways. Yeah.
of course. And how you ask the question, there's a very famous, one of many very famous well, he actually wasn't a psychoanalyst, but Harry Stack Sullivan was a psychiatrist who was a big influence on me. He came up with a technique of interviewing. It's called the psychiatric interview, and
Wow.
it's based on questioning people, right?
Uh-huh.
Question, but you can't really teach it.
Right.
I've had supervisees who think that what this means is that you just, like a prosecuting attorney, you just fire questions at people.
Yeah.
And that's not going to do it.
Yeah.
You have to have some kind of genuine curiosity about it yourself. Otherwise, the person will understandably feel kind of, cornered.
Yeah. You always go back to the old traditional thought of a psychologist having you lying on the chair and asking all these questions, but that's obviously so antiquated now.
And that's another thing. The Hollywood hasn't done us a good service. I mean,
Yeah.
most of the shrinks that Hollywood produces are maniacs.
Yeah. Love it, love it, love it. Fascinating stuff. I mean, I could go on about this stuff forever. But I'd love to dive into the unconscious in a bit more detail because, again, there's always that misunderstanding between subconscious, unconscious. What actually is it, and what role does it play? So I'd love for you to break that down for us, for people that might be interested to dive a little deeper into that side of things.
Sure. So there's so many examples. If you have someone who's regularly trying to do good things for you, someone that you don't know very well in the office, who gives substantial presents to everyone, right? And is always jolly and happy, and right.
Yeah.
The likelihood is that something significant is being played out there. They are a lovely person, and they give all these gifts to people.
Yeah.
Most people think, well, that's just amazing. Susie is just like the sweetest thing. Look at what she's doing. But that would strike someone in my field to be, worthy of inquiry. Like, what's going on there?
It's almost like overcompensation of some kind, possibly.
Something, right? That's what you'd think. You'd think, like, what's going on there? So that's an obvious example of what you're asking. And I think it's unfortunate too that unless things are going wrong psychologically, most people are not that interested.
Yeah.
I once had a couple who came to see me whose relationship was really going well, but they had a little hiccup about something and they wanted to talk about it before it grew. That's very rare.
Yeah.
Typically, people come into my office when, their life is a shit show. Sorry.
Yeah. That's right.
That's when I see them. I don't know what to do about that, actually. I don't know what we can do about that. I think, most of the world is brought up in families who don't know anything about this. They have no exposure to it, academic interest. They have no, and so they can be lovely people and everything can be great, but they grow up with a deficit because, not knowing one's psychology is a real problem because it'll bite later.
Absolutely. And I suppose that's the hardest thing. A lot of people don't want to do the work to dive in because it can be painful and it can be difficult and heavy. And
yeah, it is especially psychoanalysis is by its nature disruptive. It's meant to be. It's not, I mean, if done well, obviously it's not judgmental, but it is all about questioning.
Yeah.
It's all about why this and why that and what does this mean to that? And it's not going to be a calm ride. Hopefully it'll be an enjoyable ride in many ways, but it's not going to be a calm one.
Yeah. And you'll get some results at the end of it, but you've got to go through the journey.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can't just stay on the surface and then never do anything. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Fascinating. And just out of interest, do you find that working with people on Zoom is very different from a results point of view than working with them face to face? Or nowadays, can you get the same result, one or the other?
That's always an interesting question for me. When I was in graduate school, we were all very much against phone sessions. We thought that's just so off-putting. Like, how can you possibly have a phone session?
Yeah.
Well, of course, we have phone sessions all the time. And then, seeing people on screen just seemed like complete, like bad practice. Like, how could you ever do that? I think it differs by the person. I think there's no question that we've become less related. That's a thing to talk about. When a person's related, it means that you have some sense of psychological mindedness. And I think, so many of my folks in my practice communicate almost exclusively by text. And so getting on screen is considered to be almost an intimate exchange. Hardly anybody uses the telephone anymore. The telephone is like reserved for, people are like aghast if you call them on the telephone.
Yeah.
They would become less and less related and less human in that way. But that said, if somebody really wants to work, if they're really curious and committed to, talking about things that they'd probably rather not talk about and can benefit from that work, I find people do extremely well on the screen.
Fascinating, yeah.
I think the notion of progress, though, is important to note because the kind of thing that I do isn't typically measured by inventories or metrics. It's a question of engagement. I feared before I saw people on screen that there would be a necessary superficiality to it, which isn't true. Again, if people want to work, I've had years-long treatments with people I've never actually seen in public. Sorry, in person or in public. I just haven't seen them. I don't like that. I'd much rather see the person.
Yeah.
It feels better for both of us. But people do very well on the screen.
And it's a good point that you mentioned that these days text has become the main form of communication. So when you do get someone on the screen, that's like huge for them. You're one of the few people that they actually, let alone speak on the telephone, you're actually talking to them face to face. That's like, wow. Right. So that you're a big person in their life to be able to give them that time. So that's quite fascinating.
I taught at New York University for many years. And one year I was there, the dean, the undergraduate dean, insisted that the entering freshman class, all meet one another in person.
Right. Wow.
They couldn't just meet on the NYU Facebook thing.
Yeah.
They actually had to look one in the eye and shake their head. And the students thought this was just great.
Yeah.
I would hear them in the halls. It was, you know what? We actually had to meet one another. It was amazing. I mean, it was so funny to me that perfectly human thing then, and especially now, is a rarity.
Absolutely.
But when they were doing it, like they couldn't register for class until they had met the entire family.
Yeah, that's very cool. Very cool. I love that. So true. Just goes to show you again how humans are really pack animals. We're social creatures. We need interaction. Yeah.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Even though there's all these amazing tools and technologies popping up every day, there's still a general human driver that has to be met. Yeah. Yeah. Fascinating. Now, I want to talk a bit about symbolism, because I know that's something that you're quite well versed in as well. And what does that actually mean, symbolism, and how does that affect our day-to-day in our lives and our psychological mindset as well?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. We could go on for many days on that one. Symbolism, just, I'm not going to get lost in the rough on this one, but basically a symbol is something that represents something.
Yep.
So the world is, I mean, everything in the world is a symbol in that way.
Yeah, true.
I think more substantively, if we look at things like the Christian cross, and let's just take that as an example, pretty much no one in the world will see that configuration of wood or iron and not have an association to religion,
Yep.
not have an association to God.
Right. Yeah.
In fact, it's just two pieces of wood or two pieces of metal.
Yeah.
But the symbolism is to something else.
True.
On a more complicated level, everything we do is saturated in symbolism. So the handshake, the way you say hello, the words that you use are all associated to something else. So symbolism can't exist without associations to it.
Yes, 100%. Yeah.
And whether you're reading literature or you're in a psychoanalysis, part of what you get is to think about the texture of different symbolic expressions.
Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously, and there are a lot of jokes on this. If you have if somebody has a dream about a train going into a tunnel, Hollywood will say that's a symbol for the sexual act, right?
Right.
Over and over and over again, right? That's not necessarily true or useful. The best way, at least as I have been taught, the best way to help people understand symbolism is not to tell them what they are, but to ask them what they see.
Yeah.
Right.
Their own interpretation of whatever it is that they're.
Right. And the interpretation isn't the answer. There is no answer. Dreams have more material in them than we'll ever know. But if you're going to get something out of your dream work, you, the dreamer, have to be curious about what your associations are. And associations aren't thoughts. Associations are, okay, so I had a dream about a train going through a tunnel. What comes to mind? And what comes to my mind may be, my father pounding his fist on the table. It may have nothing to do with anything sexual or penetrative.
Gotcha.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But there is, on a less doctrinaire, more liberal level, a train going into a tunnel is, with no judgment, it's an act of penetration. Right? That's there. So then what comes to your mind with that? And that could be, time I saw my brother stabbed, or when I was ice fishing and I stabbed a fish. I mean, whatever that is.
Could be very subjective. Yeah.
It's all subjective. And if it's not subjective, then it's not worth anything.
True.
The dream books are ridiculous. All the dream books are just ridiculous
because you can't have a blanket set of rules and interpretations for everybody. It's so subjective. I agree.
That's right. Yeah.
Fascinating. I love that. Yeah. And really, symbolism or symbols are just another way to say, how do we interpret everything in life? Everything are symbols in a way.
Right. It's an opportunity to, right. Well, I think it was Richard Rorty who said that human consciousness is interpretation.
Yeah. I mean, that's all it is.
It's all interpretation. Right.
Yeah. Fascinating stuff. Love it. Now, I want to kind of give the audience some basic tips and tricks. And I know this is not easy to do because we can't do it in a blanket fashion and we're not having a session, but just to give people some really basic strategies for having better conversations, first of all, with themselves, and then therefore with other people. What kind of stage can you set, or what kind of general techniques or things to think about that might help people along that journey to trying to achieve anything further in that respect?
Sure. I think the first thing that I'd say about that is that you have to be curious.
Yeah. And
if you're not curious, then you should be curious about why you're not curious.
I love that. Yeah.
Because without that, you can't do this in a kind of paint by numbers way. You can't teach someone to be psychologically incisive or psychologically healthy. You can't teach them to do it.
Yeah.
But you can wonder with them why they're not curious. If they are curious, then a good, I say this all the time too, in addition to thinking about what the concrete situation is that you're describing, What's an example? I had a fight with my girlfriend and she threw a glass at my head. It's like,
Right.
okay, that actually happened to me once. I think it was a beer
I
bottle.
won't ask you why that happened, but anyway, that's for another podcast.
I'm sure. Um, but okay, so my girlfriend throws a beer bottle at my head.
Right.
That's what literally happened. What comes to mind? What comes to mind is a question I ask all the time.
Wow.
What comes to mind is another way of saying, what's your association?
Yeah. So what
Right?
does that mean to you? Yeah. What do you think about that? Yeah. How does it make you feel? Whatever. Yeah.
Right. So right. So that's what they can do. They can, instead of, one of the hallmarks of not doing well, in a sense, is if you're having the same conversation with the same person, which happens all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
People screaming and yelling at one another. It's the same, it's because you didn't bring home the milk, or I didn't go to the party, or you got the wrong thing, over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Really, people having the same stupid conversation, right?
Yeah.
Now, the point about that, this is answering your question, what can people do? So if you find yourself that you're doing that, and everybody does that, you can ask yourself, what's going on there?
Yeah.
Right. I'm really angry at my partner because she didn't show up for dinner. And so I'm enraged. We keep talking about that.
Yeah.
It's not about the dinner. It's about that this has been a pattern that I in my life, I'm just making this up. I in my life have had many people not show up for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So they're not showing up for dinner just really saddens me and makes me angry.
Yeah.
That's the conversation.
Gotcha.
The conversation, then let's keep talking about that. Conversation is, this is really triggering to me, and this is why. So I'd like you to be more conscientious. And when you say you're going to be somewhere, I'd like you to be there in time. That's an example.
So first of all, curiosity, in terms of yourself and in terms of other people and the situation. And also you just brought up a really interesting point as well, in a way that it's about how we frame the questions to ourselves and to others. Instead of asking the same question, maybe ask a different question, same question in a different way.
Right. And I think another thing to keep in mind is that the emotions that are elicited in these ridiculous arguments, the emotions are always real. The literalness of the complaint, is superfluous, but the emotions never lie.
Sure.
So if you're enraged about the, so-and-so not coming to your birthday party, the rage needs to be explored.
Yes.
Like, what are you actually angry about? And where does that start?
Yeah.
Right. Because I think too often the baby gets thrown off with the bathwater. People think, well, that's just a stupid conversation. Let's not have it again. And if you do that, you're missing all the music. The music is in the emotion. It's not in the detail of the reiterate.
Explore the emotion and the result and the trigger versus the literal complaint, which might be just a band-aid, which might be just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
Love it. All right. That's fantastic. Anything else that you'd like to add on that?
I think this is all really hard. I think it's one of the reasons people don't come to see folks like me, or don't come to see folks like me until they're going out of their skin, is because it's really hard. It's really hard to look at yourself. It's really humbling. It's really hard. It's hard to recognize that, you have a psychology and you don't know what you're doing most of the time. Yeah. I mean, I'll leave you with this, which is, I think, one of the favorite stories. I forgot the first person who actually said this, but it's been said that there are 3 narcissistic injuries to mankind.
Wow.
First one was Galileo, who said, you know what? We're not the center of the universe. That was a huge blow because we thought we were.
Yeah.
He said, we're the center of the universe. The second one was Darwin, who said, there is no God. We climb out of the slime. We're just creatures on the planet.
Yep.
Evolutionary theory. That was number 2. And then Freud, 3, who came along and said, we don't really know what we're doing. Yeah. And I think if you take like a Galileo, Darwin, and Freud, and you're curious about that, I think you're going to be.
Wow, what a great way to finish that segment. I love it. Well, Nicholas, tell us a bit more about what you do, and do you specialize in any particular area, etc., or is there any particular field that you would like to explore with people?
Not really. No, I'm a psychoanalyst. The vast majority of my practice is long-term treatment for adults.
Yep.
I see 18-year-olds. I won't go any lower than 18 typically.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah.
So people who come in with a host of identifiable problems and they're curious about what's going on there. So that's what I do.
Great. Okay. So anyone 18 and above, and you can do that either face to face or via Zoom, and happy to explore. And obviously, it can be as short or as long as a relationship as it needs to be.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Wow, fascinating. And so, I'd love to hear more about your podcast. Tell everybody a bit more about your podcast.
My podcast, that was a little more spiffy than it's been. My podcast is called Mental Health in Business.
Love it.
Sometimes I call it Mental Health and Business. Sometimes I call it Mental Health in Business, not an oxymoron.
Or maybe you should call it Mental Health is Business, or Business is Mental Health, or Business needs mental health. Could all be synonymous.
Yeah. So I've had the fortune to interview a lot of interesting people who are often at the top of their field, who are also interested in the psychological welfare of their employees and how the business world, generally described, doesn't have to be some kind of hellhole, which it often is.
Yeah.
I developed this podcast, such as it is, after years and years of just hearing people hate their jobs and just hating their jobs. And there are many reasons why we hate our jobs, but one of the common ones, is that the typical workplace is really unaware of everything that we've talked about right here. There's no interest in or capacity for psychological sophistication or sensitivity. I mean, it's gone the opposite direction in many ways, with a lot of silliness where everyone's always aggrieved and everyone's, sort of neurotically upset about things. But I think there's a general lack of basic psychological awareness.
Yep, I agree.
So, I talk to a lot of people about that, and we typically have a good time.
Wow. And do you talk to people from all parts of the world, any particular fields, or it's just anyone?
No, I've been really surprised at the response to this. And I've spoken to people from Australia, Uruguay.
Wow.
Trouble in that. I mean, all throughout Europe, Switzerland, Denmark, Germany, France, all over. And it's amazing to me how interested people are in this. And it's a small sample size, but I'm heartened that people are actually, there are a lot of people out there who are extremely successful, but also are interested in creating environments that people want to be in. There's one of my favorite was a fellow Australian. I think he's Australian. I might get that wrong. Who runs a very high-end physical athletic coaching practice.
Wow. Yeah.
It just started from scratch. He was a personal trainer, built this empire for himself.
Amazing.
Anyway, so yeah.
Yeah, pretty cool. I always find it fascinating. And I like, what you just mentioned is that it's so important to be aware of others and other psychological states and triggers if you're running a business or running a team, but you've also got to be looking at your own. Like, a lot of people always forget to look at themselves. It's a whole balanced equation.
For sure. And as hard to do.
Yep. Fantastic. And the other thing that I think about a lot is, in democratic and capitalist societies, obviously work is a big part of our life. And our career is a big part of our life. We spend more and more time doing that. A lot of what we do and a lot of our aspirations are wrapped up in what we're trying to achieve from a work point of view. How different would that be if we lived in a socialist or a communist society? Our whole world, our whole day is our thoughts are so different because we have a totally different aim. Yeah. And to me, that's just fascinating, from a capitalist point of view to a non-capitalist point of view. How life would be different and how psychology would be different, because the strategy of what we do day to day and the meaning of life is so different.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's great. I think that's great to think about. I think in a somewhat similar way, I think since COVID and the sort of disintegration of the firm barrier between personal and professional, where people don't have to go to the office anymore.
Yeah,
I think that's a tremendous step in that direction. In that, we're not so well sort of labeled like, no, I'm on duty, no, I'm off duty. Like it's more. I think essential humanhood, that's a word, is more accessible there.
Yeah.
But I do. I mean, capitalist, right? Capitalist. If by capitalist you mean the kind of near psychotic obsession with profit.
Yeah, or just the fact that you have to, in a non-capitalist world, you get paid regardless. You just do a function. You don't really grow to a different level. You don't really get promoted. Like you might do, but it's out of your control. A lot of it. It's just you do what you're told, and you get a certain amount of money, and that's that. But in a capitalist, we live our whole life trying to climb the ladder and trying to achieve and get better, and it's a whole different ballgame mentally.
It's a whole different ballgame. I think it's possible to be successful and psychologically healthy, but I don't think it's possible to do that unless you can't read the symbols.
Yeah.
You can't. I've treated many wealthy people who at a certain point realize that, and I say this to them, and I probably shouldn't say it as bluntly as I do, but I'll say things like, it seems that you have a very expensive self-image to maintain.
Yeah, I like that.
Do you really need 3 houses and an airplane? I mean, is that
and 3 Porsches, whatever. Yeah. And the flip side to what I just mentioned as well to me is interesting as well, that because of that, sometimes if you're in a non-capitalist lifestyle, it's also developed and brought forth more creativity in art and expression in other areas like literature, music, painting, whatever, because they've had to express themselves in another way.
Yep.
Rather than express themselves through capitalistic goals, they've expressed themselves in artistic creativity and goals. And it's brought forth the most amazing, groundbreaking music and art and whatever else in certain. So it's all fascinating to me, but it's really all boils down to what are our triggers every day? What are we trying to achieve? What do we understand about ourselves? Why are we doing what we do? It's all very fascinating.
Yeah, no, I love that. I'm just reading a book that I started reading over the summer and forgot about and remembered, called Boom, which is about the financial underpinnings of the high art world.
Right.
It's really eye-opening about it's not just a social critique, but it's mostly a social examination of the inflated and narcissistic nature of the high art world. I mean, someone just sent me a picture of I don't know who did this, but some artist took a banana and took a Band-Aid and stuck the banana onto a board. I don't know if it's a sculpture or a painting.
Yeah.
It just went for like millions and millions of dollars.
Yeah, I agree. And that's actually a really good point, is that we can go too far to the other extreme now. Like when you start calling art for its sake, and it's a banana stuck to a frame. I mean, really, is that really? Anyway, I don't want to go and dive in and say the wrong thing to the artistic world. It's fascinating. Well, Nicholas, it's been absolutely fantastic having you on the show. I really appreciate it. How can people find out about you and work with you if they want to?
Sure. So I'm on the internet, certainly. Nicholas Samstag. You can find me. You can find my website. I think it's Nicholas at nicholassamstag.com. And I've written a bunch of stuff on my website.
Right.
Just having a new website designed, but the old one's pretty good. And it has some helpful things. It has some literary things.
So good. Awesome.
Welcome to take a look at that. And if you want to get a hold of me, all my information's there.
Beautiful. And your podcast links are on your website as well?
Yes.
Yep. Awesome.
And podcasts themselves are on the website.
Great. And I'll make sure that I link in the show notes to all those as well. But really appreciate you coming on the show. It's been a fantastic exploration, and, love to do it again.
That was such fun. Thank you so much.
Is there anything that you'd like to leave us with? I always like to give my guest the last word.
Gee, I don't know. I think it's, as a very famous theorist said, we're all more similar than different.
Yeah,
I think that's a good thing to remember, that we're all,
that's cool,
regardless of our station, pretty much more similar than different.
Yep. And we're all very similar in our differences, in our madness and in our makeup. Yeah, subtleties in our differences, but yeah, interesting. Love it. Well, Nicholas, thanks again, everyone out there. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Definitely check out Nicholas's work, and I'll put all the links in the show notes. And we'll see you very, very soon for our next episode, which is 248, coming up next week, I think. Bye for now. Thanks again for joining me for another episode of Playing with Perspective, the Suspended Animation podcast. If you would like to join me as a guest on the show, I would be delighted to collaborate. Just reach out via www.suspendedanimation.com.au. Also, remember to click on the link in the show notes for loads of great podcasting resources, webinars, courses, and opportunities to help you on your podcast journey. Many of them free. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.